Welcome to the Movidiam Podcast. Join the conversation with global innovators as they share their journeys, discuss the state of the industry, and share insight into the future of media for brands, agencies, and production companies.
Hello and welcome to the Movidiam Creative Leaders Podcast. Today I'm delighted to welcome Alex Cooper. Alex is a represented director by Movidiam Talent, and it's very exciting to have you on board, Alex, and indeed on the podcast today. Thanks so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So Alex, we had a good sit down a few weeks back when you were sort of umming and ahhing about the abilities of Movidiam to sort of promote you and push you into the world for your work. And obviously a lot of trust has to be developed in that relationship. And actually during that deep dive session, we discussed a lot about where you come from, how you became a creative person, how you built up your comedy portfolio, etc. But for our listeners that might not know you, could you tell us a little bit about where it all began for you? Where did the moment that you decided you were going to opt for a sort of creative career come from, do you think?
Interestingly, it came from being in a very non-creative career. So I started on the grad scheme at M&C Saatchi. Whilst I learned a lot from them, I was an account manager. So I worked all the way up to account director and worked on kind of different accounts like Curry's PC World, CBRE, Kingsmill, NatWest, RBS, you name it. Basically, I kind of covered it. But I realized that not to dig them, but they had a very distinct view on creativity, which was if your job title didn't say the word creative in it, then you weren't a creative. And for me, that felt like I was being pigeonholed
into an administrative function or account management function.
Exactly. And ultimately that kind of made me want to, I pushed against it a bit because in my spare time I kind of did amateur dramatics and I did quite a bit of writing, but because working in an ad agency was so all-encompassing time-wise, I didn't have a chance to properly have the headspace to think about a creative career. But then I actually made the switch to work at a comedy content startup, which was pretty niche, called the Wagon. And I kind of ran account management, but by the end, effectively, I was lead writer, creative director. It's kind of one of those places where you muck in on every possible position. And because I wanted to do more the creative side, I kind of had to be everything to the client. So whilst I was an account manager, I was also copywriter, I was also creative director. And then I worked with my kind of co-partner at the Wagon by the end, a man called Freddie Waters, who's now a director as well, who then directed the films that I wrote. It kind of made me recognize actually that I really enjoyed playing different roles. And so it felt like a bit of a revelation from when I was at M&C Saatchi, where it was felt that ideas only came from one area, and that was the creative department, which in my experience now I recognize is fundamentally not true.
Sure. Very interesting. Very interesting. So I think this sort of systematic approach and the labels in the more traditional agency hierarchy sort of slightly pushed you away to a niche environment where you started to develop the multitasking, words that are synonymous with startup, which is sort of doing everything, wearing many hats, and developing the first bits of creative work and creative output for businesses.
Definitely. It was really important actually, because I think when you work in a large agency, you're shielded from all of the different things that an agency does. And whereas at a startup, you're exposed to everything, all the bumps in the road. And also you are able to work in a very small, agile team. So whereas at M&C, I was used to working on big TV campaigns where they were probably about 10 to 12 people working on any one project. But within the agency, there was a lot more people besides. Actually, I was then creating campaigns with 2 people, just me and one other person. And I kind of recognized by a combination of doing that and actually because I wanted to flex my creativity in another capacity as well when it came to comedy, a friend and I started a comedy duo at exactly the same time that I joined the Wagon, and we worked in our free time on our own sketch show that we then took up to the Edinburgh Fringe for 2 years in a row. And so the combination of both meant that I effectively was working in comedy on the business and branded side during the day, and by night I was working on pure comedy. And then after a couple of years, because of the fact that I was so exposed to the video production side by working at the Wagon, I really understood how to produce films as well well as account manage them and write them. And so we started making our own comedy sketches. And that's kind of, after the Wagon disbanded, that's when I realized that I really wanted to go into directing as well, because it was something that I did a lot with my dad's camcorder when I was about 6 to 7. So it's kind of the final realization of a creative dream for me.
There's two things there, really, isn't there? I mean, there's that traditional agency structure, then there's the small two-man team delivering campaigns. Do you think that could be because of the platforms or the formats of the deliverables has changed, and therefore you don't need all this hierarchy and structure and sign off and testing adverts, because actually, you're effectively creating these things in a sort of live environment and getting feedback from them as quick as possible, which is evolving the projects. And so the actual nature of content production and the definition of audience perhaps being a participatory thing as opposed to a sort of final destination.
Definitely. I think it's that with big agencies, obviously you're going to have multiple briefs coming in and you need to be able to carve up your time efficiently. But by working in silo, it means that you're not able to do anything as quickly as you would. And I think from being exposed to the production side, I actually really don't think that budget plays as big a part in the actual production of something than I think it does from an agency wanting to justify the amount of money they're spending on a production, if that makes sense.
Well, I think you're getting to this slightly bigger issue, which is like selling time or time-based billing versus selling a commission of the success of the advert. So I think the traditional model was a creative agency would come up with a concept and get 15% of the media spend, and if they chose to spend more, they were incentivized to that earning more money. Whereas if you're just billing time, the incentives aren't aligned.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also it's that you recognize that things work a lot smoother when you I think from the very nature of having been exposed to everything, I now know that realistically, I need to trust in a core team to be able to deliver the entire project, but I don't need any more than that. I know now very specifically the people that I need to bring a project to life, no matter what the budget is.
Can you define what that is? Because there's a lot of people out there that would like that secret recipe.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think from the fruition of an idea, I think having a creative team or someone who is a solid creative and copywriter / scriptwriter is perfect. It's good to be able to bounce ideas off, in a duo. So I do a lot of writing as a partnership, but actually I do a lot of it by myself, because fundamentally I think you can just operate at the very beginning of a process with a creative producer. So rather than the producers of old who specifically dealt in logistics, there's a new type of producer now who I like to work with, who are also heavily able to talk about the creative side, serve as the client-facing account management. For me, account management is a skill that everybody on a production team should have, but I don't necessarily think it needs one person doing that role specifically for a video production.
Very, very interesting. And of course, Alex, now comedy is the hearth of the home for you, and that's where you're sort of driving your career forward. And it's a bit of a minefield, isn't it, when working with some brands? It's something I've obviously experienced as well, in the production company before we created the Movidiam Network and now Movidiam Talent. But it's sometimes sort of CMOs or buyers of comedy are challenged by the risk or the perceived risk associated with it. But as I understand from you and the deep dive we had when we took you on to represent you, it's actually a less risky process than perhaps some other form of advertising or content creation. Can you dive into that a bit?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, there is definitely a 10,000 hours rule that applies to this. I think people who haven't necessarily studied comedy or explored it as much for their brand will see it as something that feels difficult and complex. Whereas in reality, when you look at TV programs, films, branded content, there are a series of tools, strategies, and frameworks that everybody uses, like comedy tools, to help make sure that they're not relying on it just being funny on the day. In reality, it's actually quite a measured process, and there are a lot of techniques that you can use, from when you're writing something to how you film it, to who you cast, to how you edit it, to make sure that actually at every single stage of the production process there's a chance to refine and finesse these things to be as funny as possible. But I also think there's that fact that comedy now is being recognized as a great way of engaging consumers, because it is a vehicle that if you get a reaction out of somebody, then I think you're halfway there, because so many pieces of content or adverts serve to just dictate or state information to the consumer and then expect them to pick it up and actually feel emotionally connected to that. And either you're creating something that looks incredible and feels very emotional, or you're creating something funny. And actually, the former, sometimes it can often be quite an expensive way to do things. Whereas in reality, if you do comedy right, you really don't need that much money. You just need the right people to work on the job. That's a fundamental part of it, which is that if I was to go into a room and someone was to pick me just as a copywriter, I don't think the client would have confidence in me because they would see me as a generalist. I think, again, it's about labels. And the fact that I'm a comedy writer and a comedy director means that when I go in the room, a client feels that much more reassured that actually I know what I'm doing. Being a specialist definitely helps.
Something I've struggled with, and I know a lot of folks actually who don't have so much proximity to the video production, whatever genre it is, but now are being encouraged to work with video content or this word content, because everything is being done much more. Every organization or brand is having to do some element of media production. So there's more and more of this stuff going on, and I heard some stat the other day about sort of 75-80% of IP traffic globally is video. Now, of course, it's the consumer video on WhatsApp groups, etc., etc. But that is a lot of noise out there that's been generated by this video traffic. And so to have this cut through comedy, for me, I think the word universal language, it's quite universal, whatever your class, creed, background, context. Collectively people find the same things funny. And how do you hone in on what that is? It's just observation. I mean, it's just, and why is it that you can get away with it?
The short answer is time. I think we spoke about in our meeting is that observational comedians like the Michael McIntyres of the world will be constantly studying and thinking and testing material to make sure that actually the observational comedy that they're coming up with is enough of a jump so that someone hasn't felt like they heard it before, or that it's not an insightful piece of comedy, it's just a bog standard observation. So it's not so far removed that people don't actually see it reflected in their lives. And so what you're ultimately buying from people is the experience of having studied comedy and observational comedy for longer, which means that not only do they kind of have a library of material that they've been collating and gathering over the course of however many years, but also similar to, an experienced copywriter or art director or director, they have just finessed their skills so they will be able to come up with the answer quicker. So in short, there's no easy way to find it. Once you have found it, I think it's that ability to also be confident enough to test it in a format before you then go out and roll out the piece of content, to know that what you're coming up with is actually funny, rather than something that you think is funny because you've asked one person and they felt too polite to tell you that it wasn't.
Very interesting. I mean, I suppose that does slightly couple, the cultural impact of things. So, for example, joke about ride sharing or Uber or whatever it might have been 15 years ago, no one would have got. But so it's sort of coupled with innovation and how people are feeling familiar with something collectively as a group. I wonder if perhaps the multiple platforms people view stuff on now mean that there's less water cooler opportunity because they're not all looking at the same sort of stuff to find the cultural context.
Do you know what? It's the opposite. Yeah. Fundamentally, I think it's just where you're looking. I've tried to do it on my social media account on Instagram, actually, which is that there's so many different ways that you can now, many different things that you can pick apart, whether it's people's behaviors on social media platforms. So like people taking perfect photos rather than actually eating their meal, people not speaking to their partner because they're too busy being on their phone. There are always going to be different things that we can look at comedically. I think it's just getting people on board a project who have been thinking like that for a long time, because there will always be comedians talking about topical elements because that is their job. And my job is to do exactly the same, but for brands and from a video context. And importantly, I think on top of that, it's also the one key thing for comedy, which sometimes feels at odds for brands, is that specificity is crucial, because I think the more specific you can go about an experience, the more people will relate. But in a brand's point of view, they want to appeal to everybody. So they would rather, and this happens quite a lot, where they would rather water down the specificity to make sure that everyone gets it. But by doing that, you're completely diluting the idea. And I think that's the one area that I think brands need to trust the comedy writer or director more, because when you go specific, you become more visual, more vivid and rich. And while someone might not have had that exact experience, they will definitely resonate it with more than when you create something vanilla.
Alex, such an interesting deep dive over 20 minutes with you today on the Movidiam Creative Leaders Podcast. If you would like to work with Alex or discover more about his work, please feel free to email talent@movidiam.com, and look forward to hosting further conversations. There's obviously a whole lot more to discuss, including Ricky Gervais at the Golden Globes. But Alex, for the time being, thanks so much for your time, and we'll be back in touch and sharing a lot more over the coming weeks.
Amazing. Thanks so much, George.
You've been listening to the Movidiam Podcast. Movidiam is a world-class network of production talent complemented by secure tools that blend hiring, communication, and payments. Find out more at movidiam.com.